Good morning and welcome to Frost Talk. Today we have some very interesting stories for you. The Biden administration has lost an appeal that they placed to allow them to continue to threaten social media companies in order to fight misinformation. Israel's Knesset is voting on a bill that would eliminate reasonableness as a justification for the Supreme Court of Israel to strike down laws, and AI might not be coming for your jobs after all. Let's dig into it. So the Biden administration has just lost an appeal they placed with the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, attempting to put a freeze on an order from a lower district court regarding their practice of communicating directly with social media companies, threatening them with regulatory action, and forcing them to remove what the administration deemed to be misinformation. The original order came down during a lawsuit from the Attorneys General of Louisiana and Missouri, as well as a website owner and 4 other various critics of administration policies. The lawsuit is ongoing, but for the duration of the case, the Biden administration will be unable to communicate directly with social media companies as they have in the past. The Biden administration has reacted to this by making some, quite honestly, completely absurd arguments, both about how this is a violation of their First Amendment rights, it's not, and about how it will limit the administration's ability to speak on matters of public concern. It won't. To start with the first argument that they made, the idea that the president's right to free speech is threatened by not being able to threaten private companies with legal action if they don't delete content that he deems to be incorrect it's insane. Ignoring any sort of waxing poetic about the nature of threats under the First Amendment, what the president is doing is a direct violation of the First Amendment rights of the companies that he is threatening, and the users that he is threatening them over. The very thought that the president not being allowed to threaten a company over their protected speech is a violation of the president's free speech is possibly one of the most insane claims that this administration has made, ever. The second argument is equally as inane, but a little less openly evil, just incredibly misleading and misinterpreting all of the facts, which is what the Biden administration does, and thusly why they want to be able to delete anyone's content that points out the fact that they are misconstruing every fact on the earth. So the other argument is that the Biden administration has decided, instead of this being a ruling that says he can't privately threaten corporations, it is instead a freeze on talking publicly about issues at all, or saying things that he believes to be, or would like to present as, truth on a public stage. The ruling isn't that in any way. You couldn't really even construe it like that, knowing what the ruling is. But it's not really a surprise that that's what the Biden administration wants to pretend that it is, because they don't have any reasonable arguments about why the president should be allowed to simply threaten companies out of speaking. And so they have to fall back on arguments about why threatening companies out of speaking isn't what this is about at all, and instead it's about the president's right to speak on matters of public concern, which is not what's in question. Of course, the president can put out a podium in front of the White House at any time and make any speech he likes. No one is stopping that. No one can stop that. Across the world from the Biden administration's meltdown, Israel's Knesset is, at the time of this recording, currently debating and voting on their new reasonableness bill. This bill would establish standards that eliminate the reasonableness standard, which is used by the Supreme Court of Israel. This standard merely requires the court to determine if something is considered within the scope of what a reasonable and responsible authority would do. If you're thinking that sounds kind of absurd, yeah, this is really not a great standard. Realistically, anything could fall in this depending on what your perspective was, and it's purely subjective, can't be quantified in any meaningful way, and is entirely up to the interpretation of whoever happens to be listening at the moment. It's a recipe for disaster. However, even as this bill would fix a major issue in Israel's political systems, protests have flared again at the implementation of this bill. You might remember the Judicial Reform protests, or really riots, of earlier this year in Israel. Well, they're back. Protesters have announced that if this bill passes, they will be holding a day of disruption across the country. How fun. Honestly, this is such a childish thing to do. Translated, this is essentially a bunch of youths who are saying, if you won't allow the unelected demagogues that support my political beliefs to force this country in whatever direction that they choose, then I'll burn this place to the ground. And don't make any mistake. It is whatever direction that they choose. The biggest danger of the unelected demagogue is that you have no ability to stop them. It has no responsibility to anyone but itself. It can serve you for years, decades, forever, or it can abandon you at the moment that you need it the most because your interests aren't aligned anymore. Oops. These protests have now gotten so out of hand just before the Knesset has even decided on if this bill will be implemented that a couple of protesters had to be removed from inside the building after being invited in by one of the opposition members of the Knesset. It's insane that these people seem to be wholly unaware of the dangers of having a court who chooses its own, who answers to no one, and who needs only appeal to a standard of reasonableness. And what's even crazier is that for most of these people, if you were to talk to them about the United States Supreme Court, and if they knew much about it, then these are the people who would whinge about a Supreme Court gone rogue and demand for radical alterations to the court, like term limits, or packing the court to 13, or even in some cases, judicial elections. I've heard that one, and it's insane. And this is talking about a court who has a much larger level of restriction and way more checks and balances than the Supreme Court of Israel. It really illustrates how these people have no moral principles that are run deeper than simply winning whatever the current thing is. The Supreme Court of Israel leans left, so how dare you try to limit their completely unchecked power? The Supreme Court of the United States leans right, so we must dismantle all the institutional authority and destroy them. It's so wildly immature that honestly it's kind of funny. Just as a note, while I was editing this video, the Knesset did indeed pass the Reasonableness Standard Bill with a vote of 64 to 56, and it will move on to the Constitution Committee soon. This is going to cause a new wave of protests across Israel, almost certainly, likely starting tomorrow. We will see exactly when those get started. They could start immediately, just as the news is breaking. It's gonna be interesting to watch no matter what happens. So to wrap things up on a positive note today, things are looking up for workers who are really scared of AI replacing their jobs. For a while now, a lot of people have been terrified about machines like ChatGPT for a lot of reasons, but one of the big ones has been replacing them at their workplace. And while it would be silly to say that nothing of the sort is happening, we are seeing that the AI craze is dying down a bit. As ChatGPT's limits and shortcomings are becoming ever more clear. I mean, I've been playing with ChatGPT since the day it came out, and outside of a couple useful applications I've found, mostly for computer programming, I'm unsure what all the hype was really about in the first place. Very early on, I was unclear on how a pathologically lying AI could be of major assistance to any serious sort of business, and as more and more AI-powered tools, like the Bing search engine and whatnot, have faded away, clearly I'm not the only one saying this. But to the numbers, according to a survey from the Digital Futures at Work Research Center, about 36% of employers in the UK have invested in AI-enabled technologies, and these don't just include, kind of silly chatbots like ChatGPT, but also genuinely useful things like industrial robots. So that's another thing to consider too. These numbers include people not just hiring ChatGPT to replace desk jobs, but also people hiring industrial robots to make workplaces safer in things like warehouse, where the robots can take care of all of the heavy lifting. Now, interestingly, of the remaining 64% of employers, though, only about 10% said that they were interested in investing into AI in the next 2 years. So certainly you are seeing some adoption of these devices, and I'm sure that given very strict guidelines, ChatGPT could probably be genuinely useful for some companies, but we're clearly seeing that it's not becoming an every office sort of tool, as was earlier implied by some very pessimistic people and AI alarmists, and also AI acolytes. They both seem to agree that AI would be coming to every workplace in America. Clearly, it's not. If the UK is anything to go off of, clearly it's not. Interestingly enough, though, one of the other big hurdles that it appears employers are facing is digital illiteracy. According to the same study, it appears that 75% of employers were having difficulty recruiting employees that had solid digital skills. Personally, I find that to be much more concerning than an AI workplace revolution. At this point, most of the world is digital, and if 3/4 of businesses are having issues recruiting workers who are talented and interacting with that digital world effectively, it could spell long-term disaster for our, society. However, it also could be a bright spot in and of itself, depending on how you look at it. Maybe lower digital skills will drive more people off their devices and out into the real world, where things are real. Only time can tell, but admittedly, it's probably not that last option. Thanks for joining me today. It's been great having you. Tune in next time, and we will have some more fun stories to go over.